The impossible translation. Commander Area Hayes stared through the observation dome of Proxima Station, watching the distant pinpricks of light that marked the Voidborn fleet. Their ships hung in the darkness of space like obsidian needles, motionless but radiating a silent threat that had thrown the entire coalition into panic. 17 species united in fear of what might come next. "Commander, the Coalition Council is demanding updates." Lieutenant Kiran Shah's voice broke the silence. "General Vrax is pushing for preemptive strikes." Arya continued staring at the fleet. As Chief Xenolinguistic Officer of humanity's most important diplomatic outpost, she was responsible for understanding the incomprehensible. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Tell them I need more time," she said, fingers tracing patterns on the holographic interface of her translation matrix, "and remind General Vrax that firing on the Voidborn without understanding their intentions violates every diplomatic protocol we've established. With respect, Commander, their intentions seem clear." Kiran gestured toward the observation dome. 53 warships don't exactly scream peaceful intentions. Arya turned away from the view. The translation chamber was a chaotic collection of equipment, standard-issue coalition translation matrices, experimental quantum linguistics processors, and her own jury-rigged systems that most of her colleagues considered theoretical fantasies. The room smelled of recycled air and the faint chemical tang of cooling units working overtime. "Nothing about the Voidborn is clear, Lieutenant," she replied. "That's the problem." The Voidborn had appeared 3 weeks ago, emerging from what scientists were calling a dimensional fold, a phenomenon that humanity had only theorized about until now. Their first communication had sent coalition translation systems into cascading failures. Their second had crashed the main AI core of Proxima Station. Their third had somehow induced seizures in 6 different species. No one knew what they wanted. No one knew how to ask. "Director Talvek is coming to observe your progress," Kiran said. "The Krith are growing impatient." Arya suppressed a groan. The Krith, with their rigid hierarchical thinking, saw only threat where Arya saw possibility. Their species had been spacefaring for millennia before humanity's first tentative steps beyond Earth, and they rarely missed an opportunity to emphasize that fact. "Tell Director Talvek I welcome his insights," she lied smoothly. "And have Dr. Chen bring me everything we have on multispectral communication patterns. I think we've been approaching this all wrong." After Kiran left, Arya activated her personal communication implant. Log entry 47. "The Coalition remains fixated on standard translation protocols, but I'm increasingly convinced the Voidborn communication doesn't function on principles we understand. It's not about words or symbols. It might be something more fundamental." She pulled up the recordings of previous Voidborn transmissions. Each appeared as a chaotic jumble of light, sound, electromagnetic radiation, and something else. Patterns that defied classification in known scientific categories. Most researchers had dismissed these patterns as artifacts of the transmission method. Arya wasn't so sure. Dr. Chen arrived with several data tablets. "You're still pursuing the multispectral theory?" he asked, skepticism evident in his voice. A brilliant xenobiologist, Chen had collaborated with Arya on previous first contact scenarios, but even he thought she was reaching too far this time. "Look at this pattern," Arya said, highlighting a sequence in the holographic display. "It repeats in every transmission, but it's not language as we understand it. I think it's conceptual synchronization." "That's theoretical at best," Chen countered. "No known species communicates that way." "No known species emerged from a dimensional fold," Arya replied. "We need to stop assuming their cognitive structures match anything in our experience." Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Director Talvek. The Krith diplomat moved with measured precision, each step calculated to project authority. The ridge of cartilage that framed his face seemed particularly pronounced, a sign of agitation in his species. "Commander Hayes," he said, each syllable clipped, "I understand you continue to delay. The Defense Council requires actionable intelligence, not theories. Arya gestured to her workstation. Director, with respect, we're dealing with something unprecedented. The Voidborn don't communicate like any species we've encountered. Rushing to judgment could be catastrophic. Talvek's inner eyelids flicked, a dismissive gesture. Your species' brief history with interstellar contact makes you hesitant. The Coalition cannot afford hesitation. The Voidborn fleet has positioned itself at a strategic choke point. Military analysis suggests. Military analysis is premature without understanding. Arya interrupted, earning a look of shock from both Chen and Kiran. One did not interrupt a Krith director. What if they're not positioning for attack? What if they're attempting to establish communication in the only way they know how? Before Talvek could respond, the station's alert system blared. Red emergency lighting bathed the chamber. Proximity alert, the station AI announced. Voidborn vessels changing formation. Defense grid activated. Talvek's communication implant chirped, and he listened briefly before turning to Arya. The Council has ordered defensive measures. You have 6 hours, Commander. After that, the Coalition fleet engages. After he departed, Chen looked at Arya with concern. 6 hours to decode an alien language that's crashed our most advanced systems. That's impossible. Arya returned to her workstation. Then we stopped treating it like a language. What if the Voidborn aren't sending messages? What if they're sharing cognitive states? She pulled up the station's deep space scanners, examining the Voidborn fleet's new formation. The Obsidian ships had arranged themselves in a pattern that reminded her of neural networks. Connections between nodes, layered and complex. They're not just communicating, she whispered. They're thinking, collectively, and we're seeing the physical manifestation of that thought. For the next 4 hours, Arya worked feverishly, developing a new communication model based on shared cognitive states rather than exchanged symbols. Her experimental quantum linguistics processor struggled with the calculations, frequently overheating as it tried to model alien thought structures. Coalition ships were moving into attack positions. The Voidborn fleet remained motionless in its neural-like formation. Time was running out. I need to isolate the conceptual foundation. Arya muttered, mostly to herself, though Chen and Kiran remained in the chamber, watching with growing concern. If I can establish a shared cognitive baseline. Her hands moved across the holographic interface, isolating patterns and testing conceptual frameworks. The system repeatedly failed, unable to bridge the gap between human understanding and Voidborn cognition. Commander, Kiran said quietly, we're down to 2 hours. Arya barely heard him. She was focused on a particular pattern that repeated across all Voidborn transmissions, a subtle harmonic that seemed to underlie everything else. Not a word, not a symbol, but something more primal. Dr. Chen, she said suddenly, what if the key isn't understanding their language but synchronizing with their thought patterns? Like quantum entanglement, but for cognition. Chen frowned. That's beyond theoretical. It's practically metaphysical. So does emerging from a dimensional fold, Arya countered. She adjusted her equipment, recalibrating the quantum linguistics processor to focus on synchronization rather than translation. The Coalition has been treating this like a diplomatic situation. Messages to be exchanged, intentions to be clarified. But what if the Voidborn don't conceptualize interaction that way at all? The alarm sounded again. Coalition fleet in attack position. The station AI announced. Weapons systems armed. 90 minutes to engagement. They're going to start a war because they can't imagine a different way of thinking, Arya said, frustration evident in her voice. She stared at her workstation, watching as the quantum processor attempted to model a harmonic pattern she'd identified. Something was missing, a connection she couldn't quite make. Then inspiration struck. The coffee stain, she said suddenly. What? Kiran looked confused. Arya pointed to an old-fashioned paper notebook on her desk, where a coffee ring partially overlapped her handwritten notes. Look at the pattern. The overlap creates something new, Neither the coffee stain nor my notes, but a third thing that emerges from their interaction. She turned back to her equipment. We've been trying to translate the Voidborn messages into our languages. What if instead we create a third space, a shared cognitive framework that belongs to neither but can be accessed by both? Her fingers flew across the interface, reprogramming the quantum processor. Instead of analyzing the Voidborn transmissions directly, she designed a system to create resonant patterns that would interact with them, generating new emergent properties. "Commander," Kieran said urgently. 45 minutes remaining. The quantum processor's cooling systems whined as they struggled to manage the heat generated by the complex calculations. Arya ignored the warning indicators. Either this would work, or none of it would matter anyway. "There," she said at last. "I think I have it. The foundational harmonic that underlies Voidborn cognition. Not a language, but a state of being that creates the possibility of shared understanding." She activated the station's transmission array, calibrating it to broadcast the harmonic pattern she'd identified. Transmission initiated, the station AI confirmed. For long moments, nothing happened. The Voidborn fleet remained motionless in its neural formation. The coalition ships held their attack positions. Everyone in the translation chamber held their breath. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the Voidborn ships began to move. Not toward the coalition fleet, but into a new formation, one that mirrored the harmonic pattern Arya had transmitted. "They're responding," Chen whispered. Arya nodded, her eyes fixed on the display. They recognized the pattern. "Now we need to establish cognitive synchronization." She adjusted the transmission, layering in additional harmonics that represented core human concepts: existence, communication, peaceful intention. The quantum processor struggled to maintain the complex calculations, its cooling systems now screaming in protest. The Voidborn ships continued to shift, their formation becoming more complex, more intricate. It was beautiful in its way, a dance of obsidian needles against the void of space. "What are they doing?" Kieran asked. "They're thinking," Arya replied softly. "And they're inviting us to think with them." Her quantum processor suddenly emitted a high-pitched whine, then went silent as its systems shut down from the strain. But it had done enough. The harmonic pattern continued to broadcast, and the Voidborn continued to respond. "Commander," Kieran said, his voice tense. 20 minutes until engagement." Arya stared at the dying processor, then at the Voidborn fleet's evolving formation. She was close, so close, to establishing true communication. But would it be enough? And could she find the right word, the one perfect concept that would bridge the gap between human understanding and Voidborn cognition before it was too late? Time was running out. 15 minutes until engagement. The station AI's calm announcement belied the tension that gripped Proxima Station. In the observation dome, coalition military officers monitored targeting systems. In the council chamber, representatives from 17 species debated last-minute diplomatic options. And in the translation chamber, Commander Arya Hayes stared at her burned-out quantum processor, mind racing. "We need to get this back online," she muttered, fingers prodding the device's cooling system. Dr. Chen shook his head. "The circuits are fried. Even if we could restart it, the calibration would take hours." Arya slammed her hand against the workstation. "We don't have hours. We have minutes." Lieutenant Kiran was monitoring coalition communications. "The Krith battle group is taking lead position," he reported. "General Vrax is broadcasting final warnings to the Voidborn fleet." "Warnings they can't understand," Arya said, frustration evident in her voice. She stared at the holographic display showing the Voidborn ships. Their formation had stabilized into a complex geometric pattern that reminded her of fractals. Patterns within patterns, infinite complexity emerging from simple rules. Something clicked in her mind. "That's it," she whispered. "They don't think in words or concepts. They think in patterns. Recursive, self-similar patterns." She turned to Chen. The station's main communication array, Can we repurpose it to broadcast fractal patterns instead of standard transmission protocols? Chen blinked. Theoretically, yes, but... No time for but, Area interrupted. Lieutenant, get me direct access to the main array. Kieran hesitated. That would require Director Talvek's authorization. Then get it. Tell him it's our last chance to avoid war. While Kieran contacted the Krith director, Area and Chen worked frantically to reconfigure the station's main communication array. It wasn't designed for the kind of transmission Area envisioned, but with some creative programming and a willingness to ignore safety protocols, it might work. 10 minutes until engagement. Director Talvek arrived, his normally composed demeanor showing cracks of anxiety. The ridge of cartilage around his face was fully extended, a sign of extreme stress in his species. Commander Hayes, Lieutenant Shaw says you have a solution. Area didn't look up from her work. Not a solution, a possibility. I need authorization to repurpose the main communication array. That array is critical to our defense systems. Talvek objected. The Council would never. The Council is about to start a war based on a misunderstanding. Area snapped. I need the array. Talvek stared at her for a long moment, inner eyelids flickering rapidly. Then, to everyone's surprise, he nodded. You have 5 minutes, Commander. After that, I cannot countermand the Council's orders. He pressed his authorization key against the station's security scanner. Access granted to primary systems flashed across Area's display. Thank you, Director, she said sincerely. As Talvek departed, Area and Chen worked with renewed urgency, reprogramming the station's main array to broadcast a complex fractal pattern, one that mirrored what they'd observed in the Voidborn fleet formation, but incorporated elements of human cognitive patterns. 7 minutes until engagement. We're ready, Chen announced. But Area, even if this works, even if we establish some kind of communication, how do we convey peaceful intentions to a species that doesn't think like us? Area stared at the display. The Voidborn ships remained in their complex formation. The Coalition fleet was moving into final attack positions. We need a single concept, she said slowly. Something fundamental to both our species. Something that transcends linguistic barriers. She thought of the coffee stain on her notes, of overlapping patterns creating something new. She thought of the Voidborn emerging from their dimensional fold, of humans venturing from Earth into the cosmos. Emergence, she whispered. What? Chen looked confused. Emergence, Area repeated, louder this time. The concept that complex systems and patterns arise from relatively simple interactions. It's fundamental to how the universe works, from quantum physics to consciousness itself. She turned to the communication console. We'll encode the concept of emergence into the fractal pattern. Not as a word, but as a mathematical expression of the principle itself. Her fingers moved across the interface, programming the complex equation that represented emergence theory into the fractal pattern they created. 5 minutes until engagement. Broadcasting now, Area announced as she activated the reprogrammed array. The station hummed as the main communication array directed its full power toward the Voidborn fleet. On the holographic display, the transmission appeared as an expanding wave of complex patterns, fractals within fractals, representing the mathematical concept of emergence. For a long moment, nothing happened. The Voidborn fleet remained static. The Coalition ships continued their approach. 3 minutes until engagement. It's not working, Kieran said quietly. Area refused to give up. She studied the pattern they were broadcasting, looking for flaws, for missing elements. What was she overlooking? Then she saw it, a subtle imbalance in the equation, a missing variable that represented the observer's role in emergence. The consciousness that perceives the pattern is part of the pattern itself. We forgot ourselves, she murmured, quickly adjusting the equation to include this critical element. The modified pattern pulsed outward from the station. This time, the response was immediate. The Voidborn fleet began to move, ships rearranging themselves into a new formation that perfectly mirrored the fractal pattern Area had transmitted. More than mirrored, it complemented it, adding layers of complexity that enhanced the original pattern. They understand, Area breathed. They're not just receiving, they're responding. 2 minutes until engagement. On the tactical display, the Coalition fleet had paused its advance, commanders confused by the Voidborn's unexpected movement. Director Talvek's voice came through the communication system. Commander Hayes, what are we seeing? Communication, Director, Area replied, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. True communication. The Voidborn are engaging with our pattern, adding to it, enhancing it. Can you determine their intentions? I think. Area studied the evolving pattern on the display. I think they're trying to synchronize with us. To establish a shared cognitive framework. 1 minute until engagement. 2 minutes until engagement. On the tactical display, the Coalition fleet had paused its advance, commanders confused by the Voidborn's unexpected movement. Director Talvek's voice came through the communication system. Commander Hayes, what are we seeing? Communication. Director, Area replied, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. True communication. The Voidborn are engaging with our pattern, adding to it, enhancing it. Can you determine their intentions? I think. Area studied the evolving pattern on the display. I think they're trying to synchronize with us, to establish a shared cognitive framework. 1 minute until engagement. The Coalition fleet remained poised to attack. Despite the Voidborn's response, military protocols demanded they proceed unless explicitly ordered to stand down. We need to go deeper, Area decided. We need to give them a concept they can't misinterpret. She turned to the communication console again, fingers flying across the interface. Into the fractal pattern of emergence, she encoded a new element. A single word, not as text, but as pure concept, mathematical and precise. Harmony. The quantum equations representing this concept, the mathematical expression of different systems working together, creating something greater than their parts, merged with the fractal pattern of emergence. The station's communication array broadcast this enhanced signal toward the Voidborn fleet. 30 seconds until engagement. The Voidborn ships suddenly began to pulse with light, not the harsh brightness of weapon systems charging, but a gentle rhythm that rippled through their entire formation. The obsidian needles seemed less threatening now, more like artistic expressions against the canvas of space. What's happening? Kiran asked. Before Area could answer, her workstation lit up with incoming data. The quantum processor, which had burned out earlier, suddenly reactivated, not through any repair, but apparently in response to the Voidborn transmission. They're fixing our systems, she said in wonder. They've understood our technology's limitations, and they're enhancing it. 10 seconds until engagement. Director Talvek's voice came through with urgent authority. All Coalition vessels, stand down. Repeat, stand down. The tension in the translation chamber broke as Kiran confirmed. Coalition fleet holding position. On Area's workstation, the quantum processor hummed with new life, displaying a flood of data that would take weeks to analyze fully. But the immediate message was clear. The Voidborn were not hostile. They were explorers, encountering new cognitive architectures, attempting to establish communication across a divide far greater than mere language. They're from a dimension where consciousness itself functions differently, Area explained to Chen and Kiran as she studied the incoming data. They don't separate thought from action, communication from existence. When they emerged into our space, they were attempting to share consciousness with us, but our cognitive structures weren't compatible. Until now, Chen said, watching the display with wonder. The Voidborn fleet had arranged itself in a new formation, one that somehow appeared harmonious from any angle of observation, a physical manifestation of the concept Area had transmitted. Director Talvek entered the translation chamber, accompanied by representatives from several Coalition species. Their expressions ranged from relief to lingering suspicion to open wonder. Commander Hayes, Talvek said formally, the Council requires your presence. The Voidborn have transmitted something directly to the Council chamber. We believe it is an invitation for further communication. Arya nodded. I'd be honored to assist. As she prepared to leave the translation chamber, she paused to look once more at the display showing the Voidborn fleet in its harmonious formation. A single human word, not spoken or written, but expressed as pure concept, had bridged the gap between completely different forms of consciousness. Commander, Kieran said, a note of pride in his voice. You just prevented an interstellar war with a single word. Arya smiled. Not me, Lieutenant. All of us, human and Krith, and Voidborn alike. Harmony isn't something one consciousness creates. It emerges from the interaction of many. 3 months later, Proxima Station had been transformed. What had once been a military outpost was now the center of unprecedented scientific and cultural exchange. The Voidborn had established a permanent presence, not ships now, but elaborate structures that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions humans could barely perceive. Arya stood in the newly constructed emergence chamber, where representatives from coalition species and Voidborn consciousness clusters engaged in what could only loosely be called conversation. The chamber itself was a marvel of collaborative engineering. Physical architecture blended with cognitive technology that helped bridge the gap between different forms of consciousness. Dr. Chen approached, carrying a data tablet. The new translation matrices are functioning beyond our expectations, he reported. We're beginning to understand the Voidborn's multidimensional mathematics. It's changing everything, Arya. Physics, computing, medicine. There are applications we never imagined. Arya nodded, watching as a Krith scientist engaged with a Voidborn consciousness cluster. Director Talvek had become one of the strongest advocates for Voidborn collaboration. His initial suspicion transformed into scientific curiosity. Have you read the Council's report? Chen asked. About why the Voidborn came here in the first place. Yes. Arya smiled. They were drawn to us, to all the species of the Coalition. They sensed our cognitive diversity from their dimension, and were fascinated. They came not to conquer but to connect, and nearly triggered an interstellar war in the process. Chen observed dryly. Different cognitive architectures, Arya replied. What seemed threatening to us was simply their way of reaching out. She touched the small pendant she now wore, a gift from the Voidborn, a physical manifestation of the fractal pattern that had established first contact. It seemed to shimmer slightly, existing partly in dimensions beyond normal human perception. You know what fascinates them most about humans specifically? She asked. Chen shook his head. Our conceptual flexibility. Most species, including the Krith, develop highly specialized cognitive pathways, efficient but rigid. Humans are different. We constantly create new cognitive connections, new conceptual frameworks. We can hold contradictory ideas simultaneously. We can imagine what we've never experienced. She looked around the chamber where dozens of different species were engaged in the challenging work of cross-dimensional communication. That's why it was a human who found the solution, she continued. Not because we're smarter or more advanced, but because our minds are messier, more adaptable. We make cognitive leaps that more structured species can't. One word, Chen mused. Harmony. And it changed everything. Arya nodded. Not the word itself, but the concept behind it. The mathematical expression of different systems working together to create something greater than their parts. It was something the Voidborn could understand, something fundamental to both our realities despite all our differences. She watched as new arrivals entered the emergence chamber, a group of human linguists and mathematicians coming to study with the Voidborn. Their faces showed the familiar mix of apprehension and wonder that Arya had come to recognize in all who encountered the dimensional visitors for the first time. We still have so much to learn, she said, so many possibilities to explore. Chen smiled. Sounds like emergence. Exactly. Arya agreed. From simple interactions, complexity arises. From different minds working together, new understanding emerges. She touched her pendant once more, feeling the subtle resonance that connected her to realities beyond normal human perception. One word had prevented a war and opened doorways to dimensions humanity had never imagined. And this was only the beginning.